We are going to do three things. Today, I'm going to focus on immigrant stories and identity, how the stories of immigration affect what we do in the classroom. But as we talked earlier, we need to also do professional development around the topic of immigrant or immigration myths and realities, and the history of immigration in this country. I'm not going to be able to focus, because of lack of time, on the myths and realities or in the immigration history. I will focus on our student stories. So let's look at your own stories. If we are going to talk about the immigration stories of our students, we need to start by looking at our own story, being able and willing to share our own personal story. Of course, sharing the personal story of the teacher in front of the students requires a certain level of personal disclosure. They will learn about you and who you are, and that, as teachers, sometimes makes us uncomfortable because it reflects some vulnerability. And yet, it is important that they see that your story and their story, although different, may have some common themes. So when we tell stories of teachers, and I have teachers tell the stories at the beginning of my workshops, we then can build, identify common themes and build on those common themes. The identifying of common themes is very important because it leads to that sense of empathy, of commonality, of community. Our stories have common ideas, common experiences, similar experiences. So let's start by telling immigrant stories. Are we ready to start? One of them, I was just reading, says something to the effect that many of you know a little bit about your story of immigration and yet do not reflect much empathy for what your ancestors went through in coming to this country or adapting to this country or fitting in. And that is an interesting comment to make. Absolutely, the closer you are to the generation that immigrated, the more likely you are to understand and have empathy. But that is precisely one of the reasons why I think that it's valuable for us as teachers. And when I say teachers, I could be saying librarians or healthcare workers or pastors that I have been working with. That is precisely why we need to start telling these stories, bringing them out, learning more about our own story, because it allows us to see the common themes with the stories of our students. So when I was reading your stories, I saw some of these common themes. Food shortages were common. Many of your ancestors came here with limited education. They had to move around. Some had to depend on food banks and public housing, and they were thankful because of that and the ability to use services that this country offers. A number of you had stories of your ancestors going to school without knowing English. The sacrifice entailed both in the process of immigrating and also in the process of creating a new future for your family. The opportunities and the hard work, career changes that many immigrants have to go through. Immigrants that were that maybe one profession in their native country, and then they had to change because they didn't know the language or they didn't have the same opportunities and had to start all over again. Abandoning traditions from the past, that is another common theme that I saw in your stories, and at the same time making up new traditions that you bring to this country have been left behind, but you're starting to develop new traditions and adapting new traditions. Some of you, particular story was very powerful. Somebody said that she wishes you would have listened to stories of your ancestors. And I would recommend to all of you, if you have the opportunity, sit down with your parents, grandparents, the elders in your family, and start recording those stories. It is very powerful. And your ancestors came from many different countries to find a different life. Many of them were farmers, and many mentioned the fact that immigration was a difficult process, both in the past and now in the present, and acknowledging that today it is a lot more difficult than it was 100 years ago, significantly more difficult for people going through the process now. So these are the stories that you told. You are the teachers. Maybe you have never been asked to think about your story of immigration. One of you told a story of not being immigrants because your family is African American and your ancestors were brought here by force to be slaves. And that creates a new story, completely different story. Your family did not immigrate, at least not willingly. They form a completely different narrative. And yet, when you look at the slave narrative, particularly after slaves were freed after the Civil War, when you look at the narrative of former slaves trying to fit in the new communities, and you look at the stories of some immigrants starting from zero, particularly in moments of our history where immigration was looked at with fear or with hate, I see many of the same ideas. A story of resiliency, a story of hard times, a story of very hard work. That is common. So even though sometimes we have a history of immigrating to this country for whatever reasons versus a history of being forced to come to this country to be a slave, the stories, when you analyze them, have some common threads that can help us build on those common topics and build empathy.